Hello. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate you checking out this video and assuming that hopefully you've watched the other ones because this is kind of part three in this series that I'm doing. But uh, I'll address the little bit of an elephant in the room right out the gate. I am not where I normally am where I record these. I usually record them in my garage. Incidentally, it is absolutely freezing in there right now. So I'm trying this out. Not a fan of it. Kind of feel like the lack of contrast is a little odd. I'm just not a fan. But let's be honest. If you're watching this, it's not for the visual. It's not about me. It's never been about me. It's about uh, what's being discussed and the information being relayed. So hopefully it's not too off-putting for you, and it can just be a little something that bugs me. But this is the third video that I've done in this sort of line of this series, basically going through the Old Testament. So I wanted to kind of re-explain what I've said in some of the others. I wanted to back up as much as possible, and without doing what I normally do and getting into more of the finer particulars, I wanted to go through the Old Testament with sort of a scaled back view and highlight on some of the points that I feel like are more commonly known that you might consider like pop culture kind of stuff. Uh, Basically, just touch on each of those that I'm more familiar with. And admittedly, I think I said in the first video, my Old Testament knowledge is a lot more front heavy, uh, front toward the middle, and then it starts to thin out a little more as to what I've read, what I'm specifically familiar with. I'm working my way through reading everything, of course, but I have not read every single book. So uh, there are some parts where I'm, of course, not going to go in as in depth because I'm not going to try to talk about stuff that I'm not at least relatively familiar with. But uh, I thought I was going to kind of run through it in the first video, and we're on video three. So I'm going to go ahead and get into what I wanted to talk about in this one, and we may finish it out. We may not. We'll just see. I want to be concise, but I also want to be obedient. So, in the first one, I started in creation, beginning of Genesis. Obviously, we made it from there. A little bit into Exodus, into Passover, and at the Passover. Second one, we picked up in Passover, and we went all the way into David as king, and the story of him and Bathsheba and what happened there. So to pick up a little bit and kind of touch on and finish out David's reign as king. First thing I'll touch on is David had this desire to build a temple. Uh, at a certain point in time, the Ark of the Covenant, which I suppose I could have touched on in an earlier video, but was you've seen the first Indiana Jones movie, you're familiar with uh, the Ark of the Covenant, this holy object that was, you know, kept in kept in and utilized in the worship of God. Uh, the thing is to jump way ahead. A whole thing that happened when after Jesus' crucifixion was that there was a temple, or there was a curtain, a veil in the temple that was torn, uh, and the whole thing was to go behind that presence was where the presence of God was. If you were to just step on the other side of that curtain, on the other side of that veil, without properly cleansing and making yourself right before God, you would literally be struck down. You couldn't exist in the same space as that presence of God with that sin stain on you. But there was a God is always has been, of course, omniscient and omnipresent, and has power and control over all things. But his relationship with people, because of that stain of sin, uh, we had limitations there. So this was a point in time when you look at pre-death and resurrection worship, there was a geographical quality to it. That's something that if you read about Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well when he's interacting with her in the Gospels, uh, that's something that she makes a remark to him that the Jews worship in Jerusalem and the Samaritans worship on this site on this mountain where they had built their site of worship, their temple set up. And Jesus tells her there's coming a point in time. The point in time is here where people will not worship at a geographical location. They'll worship in the spirit because the spirit will be everywhere. And what he's speaking to is after his crucifixion, that curtain in the temple tears top to bottom. After he ascends into heaven, the helper, as he refers to it, the Holy Spirit, actually comes into the world. And we, believers in Christ, we become the temple. It's not about a specific physical location anymore. Took a little bit of a tangent there, but that's relevant, and I really should have talked about that before. So you have the ark of the covenant between man and God. You have this item, this artifact, this incredibly significant item box that at one point in time was stolen by the Philistines. And interestingly enough, as they moved it around to city and trying to figure out what the heck to do with this artifact they had stolen, thinking that it was going to bring potentially blessings upon them, their cities were met with plagues. And eventually it was reclaimed, but it wasn't taken to Jerusalem. It wasn't restored to the holy city or anything like that. So during David's reign, it gets brought back. It gets brought to Jerusalem. It gets restored to where it's supposed to be. The ark is returned. Well, that's the whole thing. Is David wants to build a legitimate temple. He looks at one point and he's like, "I'm a king. I'm living in a house. I'm living in a palace. I have a structure for myself, but God doesn't have a house. God needs a house." And he's a little presumptuous in wanting to do this, and God kind of slows his roll there and is like, I have lived in a tent, speaking of the ark, which was kept in the tent of meeting, if I'm remembering correctly. All of his days that he has been with the people of Israel. So, why do you think you can just take it upon yourself to build me a house? And ultimately, what God says along these lines is that while David has been a man of God, he has been a man after God's heart. His heart has been turned to God. David's also a man of war. He has got a lot of blood on his hands. There's been a lot of violence over the course of his entire reign. Not without reason, but that's a factor. And so he's not going to be the one to construct the temple, but God is going to allow David's son to be a man of peace, to be a king of peace, and he'll be the one who is allowed to construct the temple. So David doesn't get to do it himself, but he does get to know that his line, that his son is going to be the one to construct the temple. And God also makes a covenant with David that it's going to be from his line that the great king will come, the final king will come, the Prince of Peace is going to come. And Jesus is the one who comes forth. That's part of the prophetic fulfillment there of identifying him as the Messiah, is him coming from this lineage of David. But so David has that desire to build the temple, but he himself doesn't get to. Another thing that he contends with over this sort of back half of his reign is he has multiple wives. He has multiple concubines, which I learned something interesting concerning concubine recently that is relevant, but isn't entirely relevant to this story specifically, but I'll share it because you may already know, but it was new information to me. To be honest, I always thought of a concubine kind of along the same lines as a prostitute. I really didn't differentiate between the two of them that much. And what I learned super recently was that a concubine was similar to a wife, but it was kind of like a wife that was mainly just designated for having kids, which actually makes a lot of sense because I had always wondered why, for example, the children of Jacob, who are where we get the tribes of Israel from, some of those were born to his wives. some of them were born to his concubines. And I always kind of wondered why the children were treated equally, because some were of like the actual marriage, and then some were from these other women, and it seemed odd to me. But I guess to some extent the kids would have been treated the same, because they weren't illegitimate children by the view of the day or the culture, or however that would have worked. So David has these wives, he has concubines, he has numerous children. Um, there are some events and some issues that crop up there, and ultimately he has a son rebel and try to steal the throne away from him, and David himself has to flee. And there's a brief sort of internal civil war that goes on there, and Absalom is the son that rebels there, and ultimately he's killed, and David mourns, but he is able to reclaim his throne. And it's the whole thing there is, you see in David a lot of fantastic attributes, but you also see pitfalls. Like, he's not by any means perfect, and he does suffer for that. Another thing is, and this kind of illustrates both halves of that. This is, I think, is the last big thing I'll touch on with David, because I could spend a lot of time on him. But uh, later into his rule, I believe it's toward the end of Second Samuel, uh, he gets it in his head that he wants to take a census of his kingdom, of his nation. And some of his counselors sort of discourage him from doing it, but he goes ahead and does it. And immediately, as soon as the numbers are in, as soon as he gets the final head count, he regrets it. He realizes that this was a vain action. And part of the sin tying into this is, I'm not 100% familiar with the custom, but the gist of it was that if a census was going to be taken in Israel, each individual was responsible, if I'm remembering this right, each individual was responsible for paying for or purchasing their own life to be counted in the census. The whole logic here is that each individual belongs to God. They're not to be counted in a census as almost a possession of and being a citizen of the nation of this king. They're gods at the end of the day. The king is only ruling under God. So for that king to take a census of sort of his accounts, what are his, it's not accurate, it's not right. So David knows this, but he does it anyway, and immediately regrets it, and immediately goes before God and acknowledges that, I've sinned, I messed up, I should not have done this, please forgive your servant. And God gives him three options. So he can choose between a 3-year famine, he can choose between fleeing before his enemies for 3 months, or he can take 3 days of pestilence. And this is where you kind of get the other half of it. David has done something that was, quite frankly, stupid. Like, this wasn't a good idea for him to do this census, and he knew that. But in immediately acknowledging that he shouldn't have done it, and he's given these three options, he doesn't try to get all calculated and see, play the philosophical odds of which one's worse and which one's better. He immediately just defaults to God. God gives him these three options, and it's, Lord, you know what is appropriate, you know what's fitting, do what you see appropriate to do. He surrenders that entirely to God. And so 3 days of pestilence kill thousands of people, and ultimately David sacrifices and really owns up everything before God, and wanting this pestilence to stop. But it's I mentioned in the other video, I've always been drawn to David. I've always really liked David because I relate to it so much, that human perspective of loving God so much, wanting to glorify him and do what is right by him, but just sometimes stumbling because of temptation, or just elements of the world that get in the way, or bog things down, and sometimes just out of sheer stupidity, sometimes just being dumb. uh, but I get that brokenness and that returning to and wanting to repent before God. But so those are, I would say, the largest themes with David, and then we move on to Solomon. So Solomon is the second child that David had with Bathsheba. Talked about in the other video that the first one that she conceived didn't survive. Solomon is the second child that they have together. And so Solomon is the one who God tells David and chooses to succeed after David. And he is the one who is going to get to build the temple. Now, once he takes the throne, Solomon is known, and this is kind of his claim to fame, I would say, even outside of Judaism and Christianity and the religious knowledge of him in this regard. Like the pop culture part of it is his wisdom. And it's mocked sometimes, like a lot of things in the Bible are mocked by people who maybe don't understand or want to trivialize. But so he prays to God for divine wisdom. And the reason that he's granted it is because God sees in his heart that he is not praying for it for himself. He's praying for it because he wants to be a good king. He wants to do right by God and by his people. And he wants to be able to protect and provide for and just be a good king. And that's why he's asking for this. And so God blesses him with literally divine wisdom. And Solomon has this amazing reign. He's like, from an earthly perspective, he is like the king of kings. He is richer than, and just everything is so lavish, everything is so wonderful. He gets to construct the temple with all of these fine materials because it's the temple of the Lord. It has to be, done with excellent materials of the highest quality. So he does all of this, and he has this wisdom, and he has all of these riches. But he does something that, once again, we know not to do. He takes a crazy number of wives. If I'm remembering correctly, and I should have looked up and jotted these numbers down, but I feel like it was somewhere in the number of like 300 wives, like 700 or 800 concubines, like impractical numbers of ladies hanging around Solomon. Uh, and the whole thing was, we know, I've talked about it in other videos, what was one of the huge things that God told his people to not do? It was, you don't marry women from other people groups because they will steal your heart away from me. We see this happen over and over again with the Israelites in the wilderness. They're suffering, they're serving God, they're redeemed, God's taking care of them. They camp out next to another people group. They're invaded by another people group. They invade another people group. Whatever happens there, however it happens, they start to intermingle with their women. Suddenly, it's not just about that. It's suddenly they start worshiping the gods of these other women. They start worshiping idols. They start worshiping these false deities. Well, what happens? Solomon takes wives from other people groups. Well, he built the temple. God has revealed himself to Solomon twice. What does he do? He builds other sites of worship outside the city. They refer to them as the high places. These altars to Baal, to Ashtaroth, to these different gods and goddesses, little g. Uh, that are false, that are fake, that are pagan, that are demonic, that are evil, they're not God. You've built a temple to, and you have interacted with the living God face to face, and you're going to build these sites, and then you're going to worship at these sites. So it references here, it's in 1 Kings 11. God grows angry because Solomon's heart, and this is a big attaboy to David. Solomon's heart is not fully after God. It's not fully pursuing God as David's was. And so God says he's going to tear the kingdom away. But out of love for David and out of the promises that were made of Solomon being a king of peace and the things that he would be able to do, God's not going to do it in his lifetime. He's going to do it in his son's lifetime. And what ends up, and even then, he's not going to tear the whole thing. So what happens is you have the nation of Israel, but to the south, you have a really large section, which is just the tribe of Judah, which, if I remember right, actually encompassed the territory of Benjamin as well. So suddenly you have the 12 tribes split. To the south, you have Judah. To the north, you have Israel. And sometimes they're cool with one another and sometimes they're not. But what happens after this is you get into a constant cycle that mirrors what the Israelites in the wilderness did of you'll have a king, and sometimes it's of Israel, sometimes it's of Judah, sometimes they mirror one another in what they're doing, but you'll have a king who is after God, who is pursuing God. He is fixing up the temple. He's doing things, and the weird thing is it references a lot of them as you read through First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. A lot of them it'll say the things they did right. They did this before God. But they didn't tear down the high places. They didn't tear down those altars to these false gods. It's like, and what this sort of speaks to is something that we get plagued by today. We're called as Christians to be peaceful and be loving, but stand firm. So it's not, say, about rising up against the world and burning the world down and fighting the establishment and standing up to the man, and it's not about that, but it's also not about being lukewarm or mixed in our convictions. There is an element of that we have to be obedient to the truth. So if I'm a king of Israel or a king of Judah, and I am being and the temple Jerusalem would have been in Judah, but so I am doing all the right things, and I want to be right by God, and I'm doing this with his temple, and but it's easier for me to just leave these other worship sites in place because there are people who are still using them, and I don't want to rock any boats. So it's sending a mixed message, and mixed messages don't work with God. So the nations suffer. So uh, something here, the well, the Bible in general, but especially the Old Testament, something that's important to know that I realized recently a lot of people don't know. It's not chronological. So you go through the historical books, the Mosaic books, and there is a sense of order and sequence there. But for example, we get into First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, and then we get into the books of the prophets, and there are a lot of overlapping events. Or then, for example, something that we'll be getting to ahead, the book of Job. The book of Job, which is in kind of the middle-ish of the Old Testament, it's right next to Psalms, takes place chronologically in like post-flood Genesis. So there's a little bit of back and forth here, but I'm going to move next into talking a little bit about First and Second Kings because there are two figures in particular in First and Second Kings that I think, once again, going back to kind of my motivation in doing this and trying to help familiarize with more of the popular stories and known names, we have Elijah and Elisha. Uh, yeah, don't feel bad. That's confused me my entire life. So, uh, some of the notable first came Elijah, Elijah. So a couple of things that were really prominent with him, and once again, I want to encourage in telling all this stuff you to read your Bible. I would absolutely encourage going through and reading First and Second Kings, and some of it, it's all relevant. I'd take none of that away. But I acknowledge that a little bit of it can read a bit dry sometimes because it does sequence king to king to king sometimes. But then you get into these stories of what the prophets were doing, and Elijah was dealing with King Ahab, who was just a terrible human being, uh, whose wife was Jezebel. I know you've heard of her, and contending with them. So one of the big things with Elijah was dealing with the prophets of Baal and the story of fire from heaven. And the gist of the scenario is he is sort of going up against the prophets of Baal. I believe this is after a point where Jezebel has had a lot of the prophets of God actually slain. And so he's going up against them, and they're having uh, basically a showdown with one another. And they've each built altars, and the game is whoever's God sends fire from heaven, that's the real God. So, prophets of Baal, you go first. So they have their altar and they sacrifice on it, and they're praying to God, they're praying to Baal, their God, their false God, trying to get him to send fire from heaven. Nothing's happening. And they're chanting, and they start cutting themselves, which I read this recently. There's a section in Leviticus that talks about tattoos, which I obviously have, if you've seen any of my other videos. But it talks about tattoos, and it talks about scarring, and it tied that into this because so much of the Levitical laws have to do with, I would say, health and safety, keeping yourself clean, literally, and therein healthy before God, and not doing things that other people groups were doing in relation to their false gods. So we see here, what do the prophets of Baal start doing, trying to get Baal's attention? They start cutting themselves. That the scarring, intentional scarring, is a part of their pagan worship. So nothing's happening, and Elijah, just being awesome, starts just taunting them. And it's, hey, guys, why don't you yell louder? Maybe Bell's sleeping. Maybe he's sleeping. Why don't you yell louder? Hey, I tell you what, maybe he's relieving himself. Maybe he went to the bathroom. Maybe just give it a minute. He'll be right back. Yeah, you know what? Just give it a minute. Well, all this time passes. Hours pass. Nothing happens. Elijah, is now time for him to ask God to send fire from heaven. And similar to other things that have happened before and will happen after in the Bible, there are instances where it's almost necessary for God to go a step beyond. One of the instances that I think of, if you jump back to Judges, was the judge Gideon. And Gideon is tasked with standing up to, I think it was the Midianites, but it was one of the oppressive people groups that had beset Israel during the time of Judges. So he gets this huge group, tens of thousands of people together, and it's like, yeah, we're going to go take on the Midianites. And God says, nope, that's too many. If you take on the Midianites with that many people, you're not going to say that I delivered them into your hand. You're going to say you did it. Send some of them home. Send anybody who is afraid, just tell them to go home. And if I remember right, he's left with about 10,000 people. He's like, okay, go time? God says, no. Nope, still too many people. You do it with them. You're just going to say that you did it. You're not going to acknowledge that I have delivered your enemy into your hand. And he has them go to the river, and basically he has anybody who kneels down and drinks directly from the water stand over here. Anybody who scoops the water and actually laps the water out of their hand, go stand over here. And I heard Adrian Rogers, who's a very well-known, passed away now, but Baptist preacher, which I highly recommend looking him up. He's fantastic. But I was listening to one of his sermons recently talking about this, and it was talking about being bold but also cautious. And it put it in the context that these guys are near an enemy camp. They're within a relative distance of, I think it was the Midianites, but the people that they're going up against. So to casually just drop down on your hands and knees and shove your face in the water is not tactically smart, bearing in mind that you're in close proximity. So all the people who were just bobbing for apples in the river, they got sent home, and they had 300 men, and shocker, they win, because it wasn't about them, it was about God. That being the example here, and going back to Elijah and the prophets of Baal, it would be too easy in this instance to just have God just send fire from heaven. So what does Elijah do? Bring me water. Bring me more water. And they literally dig a trench and flood the altar. And then fire comes down, incinerates the entire thing. And the prophets of Baal run. What does Elijah do? Being the boss that God has allowed him to be, he pursues them and just straight kills all of them. Which, something that I find myself doing, which I would encourage you to do, anytime I'm reading my Bible and I get sort of hit, and I'm like, wow, that was brutal. I always have to remind myself, because I'm thinking about things from a human perspective, because I'm human. God's not human. God's perfect. He is perfect in his execution of all things. That means he doesn't do anything without a reason. So if I'm reading something and it seems brutal, it's within reason. His justice is perfect. So why would that have been appropriate? Well, let's look at the situation here. We're not just talking about worshipers of Baal, which is bad enough. We're talking about prophets of Baal. That is, people who are living their lives in a state of devotion to this false god, people who are speaking on his behalf, who are teaching others to follow in his practice. And while there are definitely multiple pagan gods that existed, that the Israelites worship, you regularly see Baal and Ashtaroth as like the two that get referenced when people break off and go back to worshiping someone. It seems like it's always Baal. So it's a, I would say, recurring enemy, and you have these people who are passionately in favor of, they are pointedly living against God in this instance. So it seems not so inappropriate that they get massacred in this regard. The other big thing that you'll know, probably reference or recognize from Elijah, so Elijah has taken Elisha as his assistant, and they both are aware that Elijah will be leaving soon, that he will be departing, and they're walking together, they're going together, and Elijah says to Elisha, ask me for something, but before I'm leaving, we know I'm leaving, ask me for something before I leave. And he says, Master, I want to receive a double measure of your spirit. And he says, well, that's not an easy thing. In essence, that's not mine to give, but I'll tell you this: if you see me when I leave, then you'll receive a double measure of my spirit. And if you don't, then you won't. And they're walking together, and they come to the Jordan, and Elijah takes his cloak, folds it, smacks the water, and the water parts. And they walk over. The water comes back together, and they're walking together. And chariots of fire, which is what I think most people have at least heard referenced, descend from heaven. The two men are separated, and a whirlwind takes Elijah up into heaven. And Elisha sees it take place, and he rips his clothes, and he ties out and cries out, and he takes up Elijah's mantle. He walks back to the Jordan, he folds it up, he smacks the river, the water parts, and he goes back across. And from this point, he takes up sort of the mantle as the prophet of focus in this instance. And I've always really liked that story. That's where I got, if you look at the channel name or the blog name that I link in, it's Ravens and Lilies 14. The Ravens and Lilies is from Luke 12, which is actually what's on this ring, where Jesus is telling you not to be anxious, to consider the lilies of the field, which are clothed more beautifully than Solomon ever was in all his splendor. Consider the ravens, the birds of the air, that they don't sow or reap, yet God takes care of them. I've always loved that, and being a bit of an anxious person, I've always thought that was beautiful. And the 14 gets referenced biblically to a double measure to double perfection. It's two sevens, and seven obviously being a very biblically significant number. So it's not that I'm superstitious or anything to that nature. It's just the number makes me think of this story. The number makes me think of God and of that blessing that Elijah received, and it makes me happy, and I like it. So that's where that comes from. But so now Elisha has taken up this mantle, and there are a number of things that he does. I could kind of like with David, I could spend a lot of time on either one of these men, and kind of like when I mentioned before with Samson, these two guys are both ones that my grandpa used to read me stories about because it's cool. They did some pretty cool actiony kind of stuff through God's power. But there are two things I want to touch on with Elijah, and then I will probably put a pin in this one for right now. We'll just, God willing, pick up in a part 4. But so there are two things with Elijah that are kind of known stories, and one in particular that I really want to clarify on because I feel like it gets mocked a lot by people that don't understand it. So Elijah is carried up into heaven. Elijah goes back. Some of the other guys are like, well, man, we got to go look for Elijah. And Elijah's like, you're not going to find him. He was taken up. He's gone. They're like, well, maybe he just got taken up and then God sat him down. He could be on a mountain or something. We should go look for him. And he's like, okay, fine. Go look for him if that's what you want to do. They go look. Shocker. If they don't find him, they come back. And Elijah gets to deliver a nice big, I told you so. So he leaves, and he is walking through, approaching the city of Bethel. If you remember some of the earlier videos, if that name sounds familiar, we're going to go all the way back to when I mentioned Jacob. And Jacob sleeps and has the dream of the ladder, of the stairway to heaven, of this portal opening up in the sky and angels coming and going up and down this stairway. That was Bethel. He took the rock that he slept on as a pillow, he set it up, I believe he poured oil over it, and he sort of christens it as a monument, and he names it Bethel then as this holy place. Well, we flash forward to now. What has happened is not that Bethel is not still a holy place. It's still the same place geographically that it was then, but there's been a pagan sort of school, sort of institute that has been built there. So Elijah's approaching the city, and depending on the translation you read, some says young boys, some, the way that I understand it is the most accurate translation would be young men. So you have a bunch of young men tied into this pagan school, and you can read it and think, oh my gosh, is that a bunch of little kids? But the more accurate picture would be a little bit of a worked up, almost mob of young men who see this prophet of God. And at this point, word of Elijah going up into heaven has spread some. So they start to mock Elijah. And what they're saying is, it depends on the translation you read, but it's go up, bald head, or go up, baldy, or they're, which, pro tip, never make fun of a man about his hair. But the bald head part of it would have been in reference to the priesthood of the prophetship that he was under. And the go up is in reference to Elijah being taken into heaven. It's open mockery from this sort of mob-like crowd of hostiles approaching this man of God. That is important context to understand and remember and take all of that into consideration, because what does Elijah do? He curses them in the name of God, and 2 bears come out and maul 42 of those guys. It says, some translations say maul, some translations say tore. I don't know if the bears killed them or if it just roughed them up really good, but I do know this: if you're getting anything by a bear, you're not having a good day. I will go on record as saying that 100%. So the bears, the 2 bear story gets referenced, maybe not a ton, but I have heard people on interviews and podcasts and just different people in different contexts. It's one of those, whenever you hear people sort of mockingly talk about God, like, oh, really, you believe there's a magic man in the sky? And you can't be any more trivializing. You can't be any more reductionist about the awesome supremacy of God as to refer to him that way. This is one of those stories they'll pull and they'll spin and trivialize, like, oh, really? Yeah, two bears just wander out and maul a bunch of kids, and you think that's, you know, that's God doing that? And it's like, that is taking the story with zero context. So to give that story some more context, that's what was going on there. The other big story that I think a lot of people are familiar with, and there are other ones that I could touch on, but trying to keep it, I feel funny even saying that I'm trying to keep anything brief at this point, but trying to keep it relatively brief, concerns a man named Naaman. And the situation with Naaman is that he was the commander of the, I believe, Syrian army. So the army that was in power at this point in time, Naaman is their like main commander. And the interesting thing is that the reason that he is not a worshiper of God, he is not one of God's people, but something about this guy's conduct, his behavior as an individual, his behavior as a person, he's the reason why Syria is doing so well. He's the reason why God has delivered them into being in a position of power, is because of Naaman. But for all that, he's a leper, which admittedly it does say, if you look at the translations, it'll say next to pretty most times where it says leprosy. The leprosy could be kind of a broad term for a lot of skin conditions, but he had some sort of a permanent skin condition. And being a man of power and having access to a lot of different means, he had tried multiple different ways of ridding himself of this leprosy. Well, in their different raids, there ended up being a household slave of Naaman's who was a little Jewish girl. And she ends up telling him, my God could cleanse you. There is absolutely a man of God, in my nation who could cleanse you without any issue. So Naaman proceeds to Israel. And when the king and ruler at that point in time, who I can't remember who was in the position of power exactly when Naaman came, hears he's coming, he freaks out. He's like, I'm not God, I can't do that. And he's talking to Elijah, and Elijah's like, man, calm down. Like, it's fine. This is fine. It'll be taken care of. You don't need to worry about it. So Naaman comes, he's sent to Elisha. He goes to Elijah. Elijah doesn't even meet with him. He just sends his assistant. Says, go wash 7 times in the Jordan. And Naaman's kind of ticked over that. He doesn't like the fact that an assistant was sent to speak with him. He even makes the remark, he's like, we have rivers far greater than this in the nation I came all the way from. And you're going to tell me to go, but kind of with disdain, like, you're going to tell me to go wash in your little creek. Like, really? That's what you want me to do? But he's encouraged to just do. It's kind of like, we've come all this way. You might as well give it a shot. Well, what happens? He's cleansed, he's healed, and he's in awe, and he worships and praises God. And he goes back to Elisha. Sorry, told you that's always thrown me. It just, yeah, close enough names. But Elisha, SHA. He goes back to him, and he's in extreme gratitude, and he wants to shower them with gifts and praise, and expresses gratitude. And Elisha tells him, you need to worship God. You don't need to give me anything. You just need to worship God. So Naaman goes about on his way. Well, what ends up happening? His assistant, which I imagine would be the same as what he used to be to Elijah, gets greedy and essentially says to himself, like, if you're not going to take anything, I'm totally going to take something. So he goes after Naaman and his company, and they stop. And he's like, oh, is everything okay? And he's like, hey, yeah. Turns out we actually do need some stuff. And so he gets some money, and he gets some changes of clothes, and Naaman's happy to give it. And he goes back, and Elisha asks him, hey, what you been up to? Oh, nothing, just hanging out. And Elijah says to him, I believe it's when the man turned from his chariot, did my heart not go with you? Or did I not go with you? He already knows. He already knows. And what happens is that his servant, his assistant, inherits Naaman's leprosy as punishment for and a mark of his greed, and I believe it actually passes through to his descendants after that, which once again, kind of back to what I said when it came to the slaughtering of the prophets of Baal. Uh, there are things that at a glance they can come off and you think, is that cruel? Is that a little messed up? Is there something wrong with that? And it's not. If you look at what literally just took place, for all intents and purposes, it's stealing from God. Elisha didn't heal the man. His assistant didn't heal the man. None of these men have worked any of these miracles independent of themselves. God has done it. So where does the glory need to go? Where does the recognition need to go? Where does the praise need to go? To God. That is a persistent problem. Well, it's a persistent problem forever. It's a persistent problem today. We have churches today that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, that are bent around money, that are bent around greed, rather than simply doing what is biblical and right, and at the end of it all, making sure that the honor and the glory and the praise goes to God. It can't ever be about me. It can't ever be about you. It's always about Him, and that's the important thing to remember. And that isn't God being egotistical. That isn't Him being power mad or anything like that. It's by His very nature what He is deserving of, and you can't rob Him of that without reaping the repercussions. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be struck down with leprosy, but it does mean that spiritually, mentally, physically, however it manifests, that if you're robbing from God, you're going to suffer in some or every capacity. So I will leave off on that. We pick up next. I should be heading into touching on Job, but I'll go ahead and stop there. If you've watched, I really appreciate it. I really do. Thank you so much. I will, God willing, see you in the next one, and I hope that you're well. Thank you.